So good evening, everyone. I hope you are doing well tonight. If you are out there listening, I thank you for tuning in, and thanks for being in class. I also, if you have a suggestion for class, I'm kind of going over some of my Wednesday night stuff the last couple of weeks, last couple of days. So if you have a suggestion for a particular class that you would like to have on a Wednesday night, please feel free to send me a text, give me a phone call, send an email. If you're on the Facebook, you can put a comment on Facebook. I'll go back and review those. But is there anything in particular you would like to study? I would love to know about it. I kind of sit here and decide what we're going to study and what the class material is going to be, and I would love to know if you have some ideas of some stuff that I do not have, which I know you do. I would love to see those so that we could work through those and maybe do some classes that you would really like to hear. So tonight we are continuing our study of the parable of the sower. We will do that tonight, next Wednesday, and the following Wednesday. So we'll take each one of the types of, some people call this the parable of the soils because it's different kind of soils that the sower sows his seed in. So maybe if you want to change the title to that, that's fine with me. It doesn't matter to me actually which title you put on the parable. It's just a really cool parable. I have I'm showing it here on the on kind of a parallel. You find it in Mark chapter 4, and this is 3 through 25, Matthew 13, and Luke chapter 8. So we are going to look at each one of those just a little bit. There's not much difference in the translations. There's not really anything really in the way of new information in one that's in the other. Sometimes it's good just to look at the gospel parallels and see how they fit together. So you know the parable. A farmer went out to sow his seed, and he's scattering the seed. Some fell along the path, and the birds of the air came and ate it up. And some fell on the rocky places. It didn't have much soil, and it sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they didn't have any root. So other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. And still other seed fell on good soil, and it produced a crop multiplying 30, 60, or even 100 times. And so then later, the really cool thing about this parable is Jesus comes later and he explains it to us. So last week we talked about the farmer who sows the seed, and the seed is the word. The seed is the message about the gospel, the message about Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus is called the Word, and it's also the gospel, the good news of Jesus. So the seed that fell on the path we talked about last week, that's where the ground is hard. The seed could not penetrate the soil, and Satan came and snatched away the word that was in their heart because they couldn't understand it. And as we talked about last week, I cannot but help to think that when he talks about those who do not understand, that he is in some ways referencing the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law who just did not understand, did not comprehend, did not accept that he was the Messiah who came into the world. And so tonight we are going to talk about this seed that falls on the rocky places. So that starts in verse 16. And it says, others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. And when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. And I know that as you have journeyed through your life as a Christian or your life as a believer in Jesus, that you've seen individuals like that. I mean, they hear the word of the gospel. They are just absolutely on fire. They are so excited. They're very genuine. They're very sincere in what they're doing. But when things start to go wrong, when life starts to fall apart, when things start to happen in life that cause difficulty, they just don't have enough root to be able to survive, to be able to weather the storm. I think of I think of trees. That last ice storm that we had, we actually had a tree that fell between our house and the neighbor's house. But one of the things I noticed, Dale Kilgore came over and cut up the tree. But one of the things I noticed is that it didn't have much of a root structure. I mean, so the weight of the ice, and it was leaning anyway, and it just did not have enough root structure to hold it up with the weight of the ice and probably the wind and the things that were happening. It just couldn't survive. And sometimes we see believers in Jesus like that. I mean, they just don't have enough root structure to survive when things go bad. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. We're going to go through a couple of different aspects of this parable. I am going to monitor comments here in case if you're on Facebook, you can throw a comment out, send me a text if you would like to do that. Sometimes with a text, I don't respond as quickly. I don't. I turn the ringer off, so I don't hear that. Sometimes I have to look at it. So how about this time of, they receive it with joy, but when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. So when you think about, and we're going to kind of break down those words a little bit and talk about how they interact, but what do we do when times of trouble or persecution comes? I was just trying to look at different words that reflect this. Affliction and persecution. It's called a time of testing. It might also be called a time of temptation, and we'll look at that a little bit closer in just a few minutes. Someone wrote, and I thought this was really good, trouble and suffering might be a way in other languages just to say that which causes pain. I'm kind of in the way of that word there, but that which causes pain. So as we go through life, sometimes we think about what God came to give us. And he came to give us peace and hope and love and understanding. And oftentimes we think that maybe God is insulating us from all of the things that can happen in life. And God never said he would insulate us from those things. He said he would rescue us from those things. So when we start talking about trouble and persecution, what kind of things are we talking about? Now, we're going to talk about the thorny seed next week. Okay, so when we talk about that, in that context, we will talk about the worries of life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things. So that's the thorns. So we're trying not to get into that tonight. What we're going to talk about tonight is periods of struggle or testing, maybe temptation and persecution, and how those things intertwine and how they fit together. And when you think about those, as we go through this, sometimes that comes from internal sources, meaning that sometimes we create that ourselves. And sometimes it's external, it's things that we can't really control, and we'll look at that as well. Now hopefully that makes you think of a couple of other passages. Passages like, my brothers, count it all joy when you face various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. So when you have this kind of testing and trial, let's spend some time just kind of thinking about where it comes from. Now, I don't want to do a big word study, okay? And so I hope I don't. That's not my intent. So hopefully I won't bore you with that. Okay, but there are some things that I kind of want us just to quickly look at without taking too much time. So one of the words that is used is this Greek word. You can see it on the screen, thlipsis, and you don't need to learn to pronounce that. I really want you to see the English underneath. It's affliction or distress. Now, this graph is built off the English Standard Version. So as you look at this, these are the different ways that this word is translated in the English Standard Version. So let's just kind of go around the circle because I think it's kind of neat. Suffer, suffering, sufferings, distress, persecution, hardships, afflictions, trials, anguish, troubles in this life. That's an interesting verse. But if you do not marry, you have not sinned. Let me get out of the way so you can see this. It's down at the bottom. But if you do not marry, you have not sinned. This is 1 Corinthians 7. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. So I was just kind of curious as to where many troubles showed up there. I didn't really look at that closely before I looked at this. Hard pressed. This one is not labeled, so that one is tribulation. Revelation chapter 7, verse 14, coming out of the great tribulation. So in a number of languages, maybe the idea behind this word is simply something that causes pain. It's from a word that means to press something or maybe to squash it, or in some ways to kind of to hem something in. It's so in this context, it's kind of the pressure of circumstances or anguish, maybe tribulation. It can be, the way the word's used, it could be financial, it could be physical, it could be mental or emotional. It doesn't matter, kind of in the context where it comes from, just that it exists. And you can see, like, one of the ways it's translated here is suffering. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul talks about this. The Ephesians shouldn't be discouraged because of his sufferings. Or in Revelation where he says, I'm in 1 Thessalonians where he says, he's suffering, and John in Revelation says we're a companion in suffering. And so when you start thinking about suffering, kind of where can that come from? And some of that can be, it can be very internal. I think I made a slide for this. Let me look and see if I put a slide up here for you. Well, I didn't do that. So let me go back. I meant to, but I didn't. So it could be very internal. So let me just talk about some ways that I think that suffering can be eternal. Ways that we can create suffering because of things that we do. One is just very simply laziness. I mean, we're not focused enough that we start to make the kind of decisions that are godly decisions. We get lazy in our walk and lazy in our spiritual life, and we don't have the same focus or the same passion, or the when Jesus talked about they receive it with joy, we don't harness that same joy, and then we just become lazy in our Christian walk. Another way we kind of create those internal habits is just old habits. When we become believers in Jesus, we change our behavior, we change the things that we do, and sometimes old habits are hard to break, and sometimes we fall back into those same types of situations so that we create this suffering, these troubles, being hard pressed. Kind of related to that, sometimes it's our own disobedience. When I look at the way God seems to operate in the world, it seems to me that in many times God will remove sin but not consequences. So disobedience leads to consequences, which leads to suffering or struggle or trouble. Sometimes we create that ourselves when we compare ourselves to someone else, and we say, well, I'm not as good as somebody, or I'm better than somebody, and maybe it's just indifference. I mean, I'm not trying to list all of the ways that internally we can create suffering and anguish and struggle and troubles and trials, but as long as we're in this body, those things are going to happen. Those things are going to come, and sometimes, very honestly, they're external. We don't create those at all. You know, I think about the Apostle Paul, and when he talks about persecution, and we'll look at that word in just a second. But those Christians that were persecuted by Paul, they didn't bring that on themselves. That was brought on to them by an outside force. And sometimes that happens in life. That's where the struggle and the persecution comes from. The world, it's just not going to view itself the way that we view it. The world is going to have different standards and different motives. It's going to have a different definition of morality. It's going to operate in a different kind of way. And when we work into that world and react to that world by the Spirit of Jesus and by the Holy Spirit, then we are going to run into the same type of resistance that Jesus ran into, and the type of resistance Jesus said that we would run into. And so we're not going to be the same as everybody else. And sometimes they are going to pull away from us or treat us differently because of the faith that we profess. So, one of those words, this one that we're looking at, this idea of affliction or distress, we're just hard pressed. I mean, it's that pressure that comes on us because we are trying to live a godly life, and it may come from outside sources, from people who react negatively to the fact that we're trying to live godly. It may come from outside sources because they just don't agree with the things that we have faith in. And sometimes it can come from within ourselves, that we conduct ourselves in such a way or do things in such a way that we create that pressure. So that's one word that he used, and we translated that. If you go back over to this Harmony of the Gospel, that is a word that we translate trouble. So it's a great word for it. So when trouble comes, the next word that we use is that's used is this word of persecution. And very interestingly, I mean, where that the other word had all of these different ways that we have translated it within the English Standard Version, this word only occurs 10 times, and every time we translate it as persecution. And that is the word that's used here in Acts chapter 8. Let me scroll up so you can see this. And Saul was there. I can't highlight that, and Saul was there giving approval to his death, talking about the death of Stephen. And on that day, a great persecution broke out in the church. Or in Acts chapter 13, the men of this and women of the city stirred up a persecution against Paul and Barnabas. And Paul in 2 Corinthians says, I delight in hardships and persecutions. And so in all of those verses, in those 10, he is talking about actually the persecution that comes from an outside source because we're trying to live a godly life. So maybe the reason he uses both of those words, maybe the first word is kind of supposed to point more to inward type things, but this word specifically is talking about that outside force of persecution. And how do we deal with that? How do we overcome that type of suffering and that type of pain? So when that happens, do you have enough roots that when the storm comes, and the ice storm and the wind, just like the pine tree that was in my yard, right? When those things happen, can you withstand those? How do you develop the right type of root so that you're not in that shallow soil? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the lesson. Now, Jesus' point is not how you move yourself from one type of soil to the next type of soil. That's what we're going to talk about. But Jesus' point is, in the parable, there are people who become believers in Jesus that are like that when trouble comes, they fall away. It doesn't mean, but I want to be clear with this, it doesn't mean we give up on them. We try to find them. We try to bring them back. We try to transport them from being in that rocky soil where they don't have any root to putting them in a soil that's the good soil where they can bear fruit. The next word is really an interesting kind of word, and if you go back over to the Harmony of the Gospels, uh, but in the and I want to go over uh, to the Luke passage, okay? Because Luke uses a little bit of a different word. Uh, Here it is when trouble or persecution comes because of the word, and that's Mark. In Matthew, it says he uses the same type of words when trouble or persecution comes. But when Luke writes the parable, he uses a different type of word. He says, "But in the time of testing, they fall away." And I wanted to just kind of look at that word for testing for a couple of minutes because I think it's a really interesting word. If we kind of do the same type of study that we did with the other two words, you get over to this word for test, and you'll see it means test, tried, trying to trap, tempter, trap, trying to test, examine, or tempt. So if you look at that and you say, well, test and tempt aren't exactly the same thing, you would be exactly right because they're not. But the way this word is used, it's a little bit. It depends a lot on context. It can be used in a good way where you're tested, and then it can be used in a bad way where you're tempted to do something wrong that you're maybe to catch in a snare or catch in a trap. So if we just kind of look at these, like one way it's used here with test or tempt, when I click this and this little thing breaks away, these are the verses at the bottom that are translated that way. So Jesus was led by the Spirit in the desert to be tempted by the devil. And so you know that when the devil was talking to Jesus in the wilderness, he was trying to get him to do something that was wrong. So, 40 days he's tempted by the devil. Or in 1 Corinthians 7, so that Satan will not tempt you. And Jesus, he himself suffered when he was tempted. So there's a way that word means to tempt, to cause evil to happen, to catch in a snare. In fact, if you look up here, when you look at this where it says tempter up here, that's the way that Satan is referred to in Matthew chapter 4, when the tempter comes, when Satan comes. But it's also used in a way that you look at something and you just see what kind of character or what it's made up of. Now, and it's very neutral when it's used that way. And you can see that here in, let me see if I can make this a little bit larger for you. You can see that here in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ Jesus is in you, unless, of course, you fail the test? So this idea of examining yourself is not that you're examining yourself in a way that you're necessarily tempting yourself. You're not trying to cause yourself to sin. You're just looking at yourself and you're asking a question: what am I made up of? What am I composed of? What makes me, right? Am I godly? Am I ungodly? And the interesting thing about examining yourself is if you do it right, nobody can examine yourself better than you can, because people see what you allow them to see, but you know what is in the very depths of your heart. So when you examine yourself, if you do it correctly, if you're very fair with it, then you can pretty much see where you're walking in that Christian life. So when you look at that, and so here it's not that you're trying to cause yourself to sin, you're just trying to see what your character or quality is. I was trying to think of a good example of that, but it's kind of slipping my mind at the moment. If you got one, throw it in the chat. But you're just seeing the quality that something is made up of. What is it composed of? You're examining the thing. Well, then you come along kind of in a positive way, and you see it used of the way that God works with individuals. Now, it can be used and translated. We're talking about it being translated as test. It can be translated as test in a negative way as well. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. And so, and they came testing him, asking him questions. For example, in Mark chapter 10, they tested him by asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And so testing in that way is they were trying to get him to do something that was wrong. But in John chapter 6, when it's used of Jesus, it says he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. It's at the feeding of the thousands. And it was like, okay, what do you think I should do? But it was only a test question. It was to see how he would answer, not to make him answer incorrectly, but just to see what he would say. And so you see that reflected in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him. I mean, you see over that in Genesis chapter 22 here. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And so when you look in Hebrews, this is Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, and this is a great verse, by the way, and he who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. And it's just amazing to me that in that passage, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And he'd never seen that before, I don't think. No indication that he could do it, but Abraham just trusted and knew the power of God, and that God would deliver on his promise. This is just an aside too, okay? To sacrifice his one and only son. And if you think about that, you think, okay, but Abraham had another son. It just wasn't the son of promise, and Ishmael. And that one and only son is translated here, one and only, by, this is the New International Version, 1984. It's the word that we generally is translated monogenes, his only begotten son. But I think probably that word, Hugo McCord did a translation of the New Testament years ago, and the word he used there was unique. And it's like the unique son, the only one like that, where Abraham had two sons, but there was only one son who was the son of promise. He was his only begotten in that sense. Jesus is God's only begotten son in the sense that he is one of a kind. He is unique. He is a son of a promise. He has many sons because we're sons, but we're not that unique son. That's a whole study in itself, but I just wanted to give you a quick aside. All right, so just file that back. We'll come to that some other time. So when it's used in that way, and this is the noun form, temptation, it can be used as temptation, but also just as a trial. We see that in James, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, test. And the test is the thing that helps show your character or your quality. It's not a temptation to do evil. It's an opportunity to show what you're really made of. You know, it's not a temptation, it's a test. And when you look at that, I hope as you kind of rationalize through that and you're thinking through what we're talking about, I hope you're thinking, man, that seems like a pretty fine line between a temptation and a test. And I think it is a really fine line. And I think it's very interesting that Greek word can be used as both. And you go through the text and you kind of think, okay, is it a test or is it a temptation? And so when you get to one of these spots in life, like we're talking about here with Jesus, and he says they believe for a while, but in the time of testing, they fall away. And if you look at that and say, well, in the time of temptation, they don't stand up under the temptation, that would be true. You might think about it that way. Or it's such a fine line. You might think, okay, but in the time of testing, when it comes time for them to show their true quality, they fail the test. They didn't examine themselves, and they end up failing the test. So when Jesus talks about these people on this rocky soil, sometimes the thing that causes our scorching, our failure, sometimes it comes from within us. Sometimes it's things that are external to us, like we talked about it. And so we look at that, and he uses this idea of persecution. Luke kind of combines those two things together, and he says, oh, it's a time of testing. So understanding that time of testing might be a time of temptation, where just think of it in terms of persecution. From the aspect of the person who is doing the persecuting, they might be tempting you in the sense that they want to put you in a position where you renounce your faith, so that they're putting a snare or a trap in front of you. But from your perspective, the persecution might give you the ability to show what you're really made of, that you're going to stand up under the trial, under the test, and you're going to prove yourself to be faithful. So you might see it as a test where somebody else sees it as a temptation, or maybe there's something that you see as a temptation and somebody else sees as a test, because it's a really fine line. So Luke, I think, combining all of that together, says, hey, it's just a time of testing that occurs. And what are you going to do in that time of testing when you are, you're persecuted, or you're caused to suffer, or in some ways you might translate that somebody is mean to somebody else, or somebody is threatened, or the way that we've looked at it, whether it's tested or whether it's tempted, and your perspective on that, like God tested Abraham. But I think there's this misconception, and I just want to talk about it for just a second. I sometimes I hear this, and I just wanted to comment on it, especially when you think about in times, if you're thinking about God tested Abraham in times of test, or if you're thinking about it even in terms of temptation. And so this common misconception is, if it is what God wants, it will be easy. And that's not always the case. The thought process behind that is that, well, when God decides he wants to do something, then he makes all of the circumstances work out perfectly well, or he clears the path. He makes everything fall into place. He removes all of the obstacles, and he pushes out of our way everything that's going to get us sidetracked and keep us from doing the thing that we need to do. But sometimes it is the testing and the struggle and remaining true to the vision, and showing our true loyalty to God, being able to stand up under the pressure. Those are the things that sometimes mold us and form us to help us develop the kind of qualities that we need to develop, so that we can be the thing that God wants us to be. So what I'm saying by that is, sometimes I think the trial, the test, it's designed to build the quality of who we are. It's to make us more godly. And that's exactly what James says. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Now, one of the words that's used there, we're not going to a bunch of word studies, okay, but one of the words that's used there is not this word for testing. It is a word that means to test something to see its quality. It doesn't carry any of the connotations of temptation. It's used of testing something like gold or silver or something precious to make sure it's really pure. It's really what it's supposed to be. You know, when I was thinking about that, I was thinking maybe in terms of like if you were to test a diamond. You know, if I were to look at a gem and somebody were to say, "Hey, this is a diamond," I don't have the capability to look at that and tell you if that's really a diamond or if it's not a diamond. It could be something manufactured. It could be a fake diamond. I'm just telling you, and personally, just me, I would not be able to look at that. The only way I would know is to take it to an expert where they could test it to make sure that it's what someone told me that it was. And sometimes as we go through life, God needs to mold us and form us. So the testing is really important. It's, when you think about Peter, and he writes about the testing of our faith, that it refines our faith. When it's tested, it becomes more and more pure, because as it's tested, the impurities rise to the top and we pull the impurities off. So if we're struggling with something, you might be viewing that as a temptation, but maybe you should be viewing it as a test. It's an opportunity to show that you're growing in a particular area. It refines your faith. So if you're in that rocky kind of soil, or you know somebody in that rocky kind of soil, what can you do to start to form some root? I just got about 4 quick suggestions. All right. Number 1 is you trust God's plan. You trust God's plan. It goes all the way back to Abraham, who is the father of the faith. God made a promise to Abraham, and he said, "I am going to bless you through a son." And then God gave Abraham and Sarah the son, Isaac. And then God comes and he tests Abraham, but Abraham trusted God's plan. I mean, even when it doesn't make sense, and even when you can't understand it, even when you can't even really make sense of it, you trust God's plan. But you test it to make sure it's God's plan. That's where some of the testing comes to play. So you test it, you make sure it's God's plan, but you stick to it and you trust what God said God is going to do. The second one is you trust God's power. If you go back over to this verse that we were looking at in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. But Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. Abraham trusted God's power. And again, I don't know why Abraham would have thought that. I don't know how he came up with that idea. I guess he just thought, hey, if God says do this, but God said that this is the son of promise, God's going to take care of it. And so God did, but Abraham trusted God's power. And if you go back and you look at Abraham, it's not that he didn't have faults. There were times in Abraham's life where he should have trusted God's power and he did not. So he had some faults. He wasn't perfect, but when God told him to leave and to go to a different place, he trusted God's plan and he trusted God's power. I mean, just think about this verse. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Right? But he knew that God had made a promise. So if you go back to that slide, you trust God's plan and you trust God's power. So the third thing you do, if you're in that rocky soil, is the struggle, the persecution, the temptation. You don't really know what to do next. You persevere. And what I mean by persevere, it's kind of you do the next right thing. No matter how small it seems, no matter how trivial it seems, you do the next right thing. It shows your obedience to God, to his plan and his power. So you look at the situation, whether it's trouble, distress, or if it's persecution, or if it's a time of testing or a time of temptation, however you're viewing that at that moment, look at that situation and say, okay, in this situation, what is the next right thing? What is the thing that God would have me to do? You know, what is the right decision? What is the godly decision? Not the decision of the world, not what other people would do, what you know God would want you to do in that situation, even though you don't know where it's going, you just know that is the next right thing to do. And you go down that path, you do the next right thing, then the next right thing, and you keep walking through that fog, not knowing exactly what's happening. I mean, I don't know if you've ever driven in the fog, but I mean, there are times that the fog is so thick you really can't figure out where you're supposed to go, and you can barely just see past the car, right? But you go small steps, small views. You just keep working down that path because you know eventually that fog will clear. So you do the next right thing. And I think the next thing you do, let me get off the screen so you can see this, is you surround yourself with committed believers. You surround yourself with people who have a similar mindset, who have gone through the struggle, who have gone through the trial, who have fought through the temptation. Maybe you know them because you've seen them navigate a situation like that in their own life. Maybe you know that they've experienced some kind of heartache or trouble in the past, and you know that they've navigated that even if you don't know all of the details. Maybe you've seen them persecuted or made fun of or lost a job or suffered some kind of setback, just either financially or with their career or individually, just because they were a believer in Jesus. But you saw them navigate that, or you just know that they're good, godly, grounded people that you can trust their advice and trust what they say. So in times of persecution, trial, struggle, temptation, test, I think it's important that you surround yourself with people like that. It's better not to journey through those things alone if you can have people around you. And so you surround yourself with the right quality, the right kind of people. So Jesus says, hey, look, there are these that are on rocky soil, and they just don't have good root. Now, maybe that's you, and maybe you're looking at your life and you say, you know what, I don't have a good root structure. So start developing that. Try to find a way to transport yourself from rocky ground to good soil. And you can't, by the way, do that by yourself. Somebody has to help do that for you. But look for people that can help you in that journey. Or maybe you know somebody and you know that they're not developing deep roots so that they can endure when the persecution and the trial and the testing and the temptation comes. So make it your goal, make it your mission, not in a very kind way and very considerate way, but help them develop that kind of root structure, kind of mentor them along. So either be a mentor or look for a mentor to help you walk through that path. So I hope that helps tonight. Next week we'll talk about all the cares and the troubles of the world, financial and those types of things. But, just develop a good root system so that you can survive the things of life. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, you can live stream with us again on Sunday morning. Sunday morning in Bible class, we'll be in Revelation chapter 21. We'll start our discussion on the new heaven and the new earth and what that means. Looking forward to that. In Bible class, in sermon, the sermon topic is, what does love have to do with it? And we're talking about husbands and wives, and really looking forward to that sermon. I hope you tune in for that. So if you cannot be with us in person on Sunday morning, I hope you tune in. So that's all I need to say about that. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a great evening. Good night.